So hello, everybody. My name is Jane Debevoise, and I'm pleased, very pleased, extremely pleased to welcome you today to our event, which is about artist-run spaces in Manila. And it's a conversation between Chuong-Dai Võ, Ringo Bunoan, and Norberto Peewee Roldan. Tonight's program celebrates the recent launch of two research collections. One of the research collections is the Green Papaya Art Projects Archive, and the other one is an archive of Manila-run art spaces, several art spaces, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. I am Jane, as I said before, and I'm the chair of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, as well as Asia Art Archive in America. I'm speaking tonight from Asia Art Archive in America, which is the Brooklyn-based, what we like to say, mini hub of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. And Asia Art Archive is what we also like to say is our mothership. It was founded in 2000 as a nonprofit organization in Hong Kong as well. And we were founded in 2009 as a nonprofit organization in New York. And here in New York, just like Hong Kong, we have a reading room, a library. You can see some of the books behind me, as well as the access to a vast digital archive, which we've been working on for the last 20 years of research materials focused on recent art from and of Asia. And we also run a series of regular public programs in Hong Kong, as well as here. We have workshops, artist talks, panels, symposia, and lots of other events. And unfortunately, of course, for obvious reasons, they've all been online in the last year. And it'll be interesting to see how this ends up, but we will probably continue at some levels online programming, but we really can't wait to get back to on-site, in-person, in real life programming, which we hope will happen by the fall. But fingers crossed. I'm delighted to start today's program with an introduction to my great friend and colleague at Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, Chuong-Dai Võ. Chuong-Dai, as I said, is based in Hong Kong, and she is a researcher there and supervises our research projects focusing on Southeast Asia. She was very involved in the two major archives that we're going to be introducing today, as well as others. And she will be curating an exhibition on the Green Papaya Art Project, which is one of the archives that we'll be talking about today, and artist-run spaces we'll be talking about today at the Vargas Museum, which I looked up is about a half an hour drive. If my directions on Google are correct, from downtown Manila. And that exhibition will take place in 2022. Ringo Bunoan is an artist, a writer, a researcher, and a curator based in Metro Manila. She is the founder of the alternative art space Big Sky Mind, which was active between 1999 and 2005. From 2007 to 2013, she was also one of my colleagues at Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. She was a researcher for the Philippines and initiated work on the archives of Roberto Chabet and several other artist-run spaces in Manila, some of which we'll be talking about today. She also co-founded Art Books Philippines, or artbooks.ph, which you can look up online. It's an independent bookstore focusing on Philippine art, history, and culture. And that's been active from 2014 to the present. Norberto Peewee Roldan is a multimedia artist and a curator and currently the artistic director of Green Papaya Art Projects, a multidisciplinary platform founded in 2000. He founded the seminal artist group, Black Artists in Asia, in 1986, a Philippine-based group focused on socially and politically progressive practice. And he initiated the longest running artist-led biennale in the Visayas, which is a geographic region that forms the central part of the Philippine archipelago. The biennale is called Viva XCon and is now over 30 years old. But before passing the mic to Chuong-Dai, I'd like to share some housekeeping notes. First of all, this is going to be an hour long, and we'll have time for Q&A. The Q&A questions, or if you have any questions, which I hope you do, they should be written into the Q&A box at any time. And the speakers will try to answer them, as many as they can have time to get to. So please, please, please ask questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Ask as many questions as you can. This is your chance. You can ask them anonymously, or you can ask them with your name. And we really, really, really want, despite the strange formality of Zoom, for there to be time for some interactive exchange. The event is being recorded. So if you'd like to revisit the event or to assign it to your students, or if you have friends who missed it, please, we'll be posting it on our website in a few days. And last but not least, we're streaming this on Facebook. So if you're watching from Facebook, you can comment on the live video. Frankly, I don't even know what that means. I'm not on Facebook, but anyway, we have our colleagues are there looking at the Facebook feed, and they will send the questions into the speakers through the Q&A. So don't worry about that. And again, we really want you to ask questions. So with no further ado, Chuong-Dai, you're up. I look forward to this very much. And thank you all of you who are out there in the audience for coming, and all of you who are speaking tonight. Thank you very much. And all of my staff, our team members who are behind the scenes, as everybody knows, thank you very much for making this, making all of this happen. Okay, Chuong-Dai, you ready? Hi.
Hello.
I will turn myself off, and now that you've turned yourself on.
Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. Ringo and Peewee, would you like to turn your video on as well? So I will keep my part of the introduction very short so that we can begin the conversation. So as Jane said, this panel is to celebrate the launch of two really wonderful collections, the Manila Artist-Run Spaces Archive and the Green Papaya Art Projects Archive. I'm going to talk very briefly about those two archives, and then I'd like to invite Ringo and Peewee to join me for a conversation. And as we're talking, people in the audience, if you'd like to ask us any questions, please do. This conversation doesn't have to be strictly just between Ringo, Peewee, and I, and we would really welcome your questions, especially as I understand that several people in the audience not only are from the US, but also throughout Asia, and we would welcome your insights into the artist initiatives that you've been involved in. So to begin with, the Manila Artist-Run Spaces and Green Papaya Art Projects, they both come out of a time when there were very few artist initiatives in Manila. This is especially true of the 6 spaces that are in the Manila Artist-Run Spaces Archive. So the first one was Pinaglabanan Galleries, which opened from 1984 to 1989. And then there are 4 other spaces that all opened in the mid to late 1990s. And the last one, Future Prospects, opened in 2005. And I'm going to ask Ringo very shortly to give us some context for why those spaces opened, what was the urgency of that time. This archive contains hundreds of records that are photographs, videos, interviews, news clippings, and ephemera that were donated or deposited with Asia Art Archive by the founders of these spaces. The next archive that I like to talk about very briefly is Green Papaya Art Projects. And this initiative was founded by Peewee and Donna Miranda in 2000. It started as a physical space with their own gallery. But as you can see from the tree structure, which is the list of photos on the left, that within a few years, they moved from being a physical space to being what we understand as a platform. Yeah, in the sense that they decided that they didn't need a physical space in order to exist, and they curated a lot of their projects off-site, but they also went beyond the exhibition as their primary mode. And we'll talk about that with Peewee shortly as well. The other thing I'd like to emphasize with Green Papaya Art Projects is that in their 20 years of existence so far, they've had a lot of collaborators. So that would, Hillary, can you move us to the next slide? So as you can see here, that over the last 2 decades, besides Peewee and Donna Miranda, that there have been many curators, organizers, and other arts workers who have been involved in the programming of Green Papaya Art Projects. And I think that this has been really important in terms of the longevity of Green Papaya. And this is something that I like to talk about as well. So with that, I'd like to start our conversation with Ringo. Ringo, can you help us with some context, in terms of what was going on in the arts ecology in Manila, even prior to the mid-1980s? So some reasons why artists decided that they needed to open their own spaces.
Hi, good day to everyone. Well, to answer your question, Chuong-Dai, it's really quite simple, primarily because there is a very weak art infrastructure in the Philippines, and there's very little government support for the arts. So artists have always been the ones initiating projects and opening spaces and starting galleries. So in the collection, in the Manila Artist-Run Spaces collection, most of the spaces, the documentation are spaces from the 90s, but this is not a 90s phenomenon. I mean, historically, it's been going on for since the post-war. I mean, the first professional artist, first professional art gallery in Manila was started by an artist. That's the Philippine Art Gallery in 1950. And then, of course, you have Arturo Luz and Luz Gallery in the 60s. And in the 60s, many artists also opened their gallery cafes around the Manila area. And then in 1969, of course, CCP opened. This is the Cultural Center of the Philippines. And this is the premier government institution for the arts. This was also headed by an artist, Roberto Chabet. He was the first museum director of CCP. And then in the 70s, of course, martial law happened in the Philippines. That's a whole nother story. And Chabet's stint at the CCP was very brief because he didn't want to be embroiled with the politics. So he started Shop 6. And this is Shop 6, the photo that you are seeing today, right now. It's a one-room affair. And it showed a lot of experimental work, a lot of happenings, you know, every Friday. But it didn't last very long also. Unlike the other spaces that I mentioned, Shop 6 was, you know, it was not like a gallery, a formal gallery, but it was really an experimental space. So after Shop 6, Chabet continued teaching at UP and encouraged his students to open their own spaces. So if we can go to the next slide. This is in the 80s, and this is Pinaglabanan Galleries, which is part of the Mars collection. By the way, the Shop 6 collection, the Shop 6 archive is part of the Roberto Chabet collection, which we also launched with AAA in 2009. So going back to Pinaglabanan, this was opened by Agnes. And this was in her family home in San Juan, which burned down and actually killed Agnes' parents and sister. So this gallery was like a tribute to her family. Unlike Shop 6, this was a very formal space, a proper gallery. It was formally run with a board of directors, and they showed a variety of works, paintings, sculptures. Agnes was a sculptor, and this is her work. And they also showed installations. Chabet was the first consultant and curator of the first season of exhibits of Pinaglabanan, and also the last few shows in 1989. By the time we entered UP in the 90s and met Chabet and Agnes, Shop 6 and Pinaglabanan were already both closed. But so we only heard stories about these spaces from Chabet and from other artists. But and actually, I never saw images of these spaces until I started archiving them. So it was really such a revelation, you know. It was something that you hear about, and then finally you see pictures of it, and then it just seems more real. But it was really an inspiration for many artists, like especially around Chabet and, you know, within the UP circle. So in 1999, we also opened our own space, Big Sky Mind. And next slide, this is Big Sky Mind. This was our very first space. We started out as a gallery cafe also. Primarily because we knew that the artworks that we wanted to show, it was very difficult to sell, so we needed some sort of income. So we had the cafe. So downstairs we had the cafe, and then upstairs we had the exhibition space. So it's like a very multi-purpose type of space. Our first show was Chabet, actually. So unlike other spaces, we were not into like just supporting young artists. It was not about age, but it was really more about what type of art we wanted to show. And because Katya and I were both more into conceptual art, so we wanted to show more experimental work and sort of channel a little bit of Shop 6 into the 90s. So it was also very multidisciplinary about Big Sky. We didn't just show like exhibitions, but it was we had film showings, we had music events, we had poetry readings, and this basically reflected the interests of the community around Big Sky. So it's not just me and Katya deciding what we're gonna do, but a lot of the programming was also involved a lot of other artists from the community as well. So we had a blast for the first 2 years, but it also took a toll on us, plus we had disputes with the owners of the building, and motherhood came along also, so we had to shift. We had to change our lifestyle. So we opened the residency program. I have the picture here now. So we opened one of the first like artist initiated residency programs in Manila. That was in Cubao. But that was also not sustainable, even though the property was eventually sold. So we had to close. And so right now, I'm still running a space, Art Books PH, as mentioned. Still working with Katya, but we've moved beyond exhibitions, and I think right now there's so many exhibition spaces already in Manila, and we don't want to add to the noise. So we wanted to do something different, and so we opened the bookstore, and this is the first bookstore in the Philippines focusing on art. And yeah, and so it's a new chapter in what we're doing. And it just goes to show that artist-run spaces come and go, and it's difficult to sustain in the Philippines because of the lack of support, but it's a very essential part of the art ecology. It provides artists with their own space, and that's very empowering, and it allows you to create opportunities for yourselves and the community. And of course, most important is that it allows you to experiment and to test ideas which might not be accommodated by galleries or museums, and it's important to document, because it's part of history, simply because it's part of history, even if it's a minority. And oftentimes these things are so under the radar and overlooked by official narratives. But they happened, and and I think they play an important role in the community, especially now when we're also isolated everywhere. So I think physical spaces are still very, very important, even though there's also the virtual space. But as everyone says, there's you can't compare, this person-to-person interaction, like face-to-face. So now there's still a lot of artist-run spaces, and like during the pandemic, there's one space that opened, and I'm actually so surprised, at it's a very precarious time, but still artists are opening spaces and trying to see what they can do. So yeah, let's see how it all goes from here.
Thank you, Ringo, for providing some context for us to understand the significance of these spaces. Peewee, can I also bring you into this conversation and ask you to talk about Green Papaya Art Projects, why you and Donna started it? The beginning overlapped somewhat with some of these other spaces. So can you talk a bit about what you two saw in the arts ecology and what prompted you to open Green Papaya?
Thank you, Chuong-Dai, and thank you, Asia Art Archive in America, for having me here today or tonight. We always have a simplified answer to that question, Chuong-Dai, and our standard answer was to provide space and some kind of support for young artists to present their work. But let me give you a context of that particular period when we started out. I remember how in the late 1990s, the Manila art scene was booming with new energies, experimentations, and fresh approaches to the production of art across disciplines. Let me just cite you some examples. In the Manila music scene, which used to be characterized by a musical genre called the Manila sound that began in the 70s, soon gave way to intricate, multi-layered and hybrid symphonic arrangements. In 1999, Radioactive Sago Project, a Filipino jazz rock band, was formed. The band's sound is a fusion of spoken word, poetry, bebop, jazz, and punk. I especially mentioned Radioactive Sago Project because they started playing in Green Papaya in the early 2000s. And the frontman, actually, Lord De Vera, became a member of the board of directors of Green Papaya. But along the Manila music scene, sound art and electronic music started to gain ground with open studio sessions and performances. Sound artists, as they negotiated their way around the creative process, strategies of collaboration, slowly formed their own communities and attracted their own public. In film and video, digital recording equipment and editing software became accessible and paved the way for some artists to explore the digital technology as a new way of expression. As we know it, video art, not strictly cinema or gallery bound, became a form that needed a platform. Dance companies, which for so many years struggled under the patronage of the state, the Cultural Center of the Philippines, for example, which houses until now the National Dance Company, Ballet Philippines, and the corporate enclaves like the Meralco Theater, which houses the Philippine Ballet Theater. As dancers started to move out from traditional proscenium stages to perform in dance studios and alternative platforms converted into public independent spaces. In the visual arts, the social realist movement, which made an impact on the art scene during the Marcos regime from the 70s to the 80s, was slowly fading away into the background. Meanwhile, the young avant-garde, honed and mentored by Philippine leading conceptual artist and educator Roberto Chabet, started to bring excitement to a new movement that has yet to claim its place in history. And the reason why I wanted to mention all these examples is, as you mentioned earlier, we started as a gallery, but eventually, reinvented ourselves into a platform that did not necessitated a physical space, because all these artists who were involved in all this, new millennium movement somehow became part of the community. So that's how and where and when Green Papaya started.
Thank you, Peewee, for making those connections between the visual arts and other genres such as music, film, video, and dance. And sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, Chương-Đài. I think it's important that I mentioned dance because maybe not everybody knows that the co-founder of Green Papaya, Donna Miranda, was a contemporary dancer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a contemporary dancer and choreographer. And I think that combination in terms of the backgrounds that you two brought to Green Papaya was really instrumental in terms of helping it to shift, as you saw the changing landscape. And this is something I like to talk a bit more about in terms of not only Green Papaya, but also the other spaces in the Manila Artist-Run Archive is the way that artists responded to the ecology, right? And so Ringo, for example, talked about how there wasn't a lot of government support. And also we were talking about a landscape that was dominated by museums and commercial galleries that preferred established artists. Peewee, I really appreciated that you moved us beyond the visual arts, to think about the influences of people who are working in other artistic fields, at least in terms of the way that you and Donna thought about, why you wanted to open Green Papaya. So just to that point, can you take us through perhaps one or two significant projects that you think exemplified the ethos of Green Papaya, in terms of its ability to transform itself and also its openness to working with other people?
We're looking at the current slide at the moment. And so I would love to mention about Smart Power Program. This program actually was the brainchild of Hillary Clinton while she was the US State Secretary. So the Smart Power Program was initiated by the US State Department, but it was administered by the Bronx Museum. So fortunately, we were the country partner for this program, and we hosted Mary Mattingly, who is a New York-based artist. The reason why I find this particular program or project to be, I think, one of the most ideal projects that we were able to handle was, it happened at the time. It happened actually at the right time in 2012, since the Philippines and the Visayas region in particular had barely recovered from the devastating typhoon Haiyan in 2013. And the workshops that Mary Mattingly brought along involved a mix of our communities. So something that we were aspiring really to develop, because when we started in early 2000 in Teachers Village, which was some kind of a residential area near the University of the Philippines, we tried to open our doors to even non-artists that live within the community. But it seems like non-artists, they appear to be intimidated by a gallery space, actually. So when we moved to Kamuning, where we held the workshops of Mary Mattingly, for the first time, we were able to involve people from the barangay, from the village. We were able to involve students, fine arts students, and architecture students from the University of the Philippines. We were able to involve high school students and teachers from the nearby public schools. And we were able to involve the usual arts community that we were having in Green Papaya. So it was a workshop that showed participants how to tap into new solutions for major disasters like typhoon and floods by using art and creativity. And I think, of course, not to mention the fact that it was one of the well-funded projects we had. This particular photo will show you one of the outputs of the workshop, where Mary Mattingly was able to design something that you can float around. If you can imagine the Philippines all flooded, or Metro Manila all flooded after a very, very strong typhoon, then this thing can actually float on water. And can we have the next slide, Hillary, please? So this is the scene of the workshop. As you will notice, the gallery space is so small, and the workshop extends outside, actually, where they were able to build the sphere that we saw floating on water earlier. So just to make mention about the workshop, how could our urban surroundings function in our built environment if our built environment is designed to move? So that was the very basic principle of the workshop. And I think I can say that the workshop was very, very successful. Is there another? I think there's another slide there. And the workshop also offered techniques and processes, how to create clothes that can function as, can cover you all over and protect you from strong winds and rains, and when there is a typhoon season in the Philippines.
Thank you, Peewee,
That's it,
for
yeah.
introducing us to this really amazing project, which still is very much relevant to what we're going through right now in terms of climate change. Some of the things that Peewee brought up in terms of the ability of Green Papaya to transform and also to learn from artists who were working in other fields is something that Ringo, I also like to ask you about. And so the spaces in the Manila Artist-Run Spaces Archive were opened by you and your peers, who all had studied with Roberto Chabet at the University of the Philippines. And so I like to go back to the long history that you introduced us to in terms of thinking about the skills that artists learned in school. Right? And so there's a longevity and a continuity, and also a transference of knowledge from one generation to the next. So one of the things that you had talked about was that you had only heard about Shop 6 and Pinaglabanan galleries. You didn't actually go to them because they were before your time. And so in that, archives are really important as vehicles that transmit history to us, right? And so that's something I like to ask you to elaborate on, but also in terms of the mentorship that you received, you and your peers received, and that gave you the skills to open these spaces. And then the other part of this question is to also think about how the skills that you learned in running the spaces transfer to other types of projects. And so what I'm trying to get at is that even though these spaces in Mars, they only last between 3 to 5 years, I don't think that they actually ended because they transformed into something else. And so can you speak to that?
Yeah, I definitely think that you sort of pass on some kind of energy to other artists when you open the space, like when Big Sky Mine closed and when Surrounded by Water closed, the artists, so they didn't have a space to hang out, so they opened Future Prospects, so it just goes on and on and on. So it's really the continuity is important, because I think for most of Green Papaya is an exception that it lasted so long, but I think for most spaces it's really like it's like you have this sudden burst of energy, and then you do so much, and then you're like completely burnt out. And then you sort of have to recoup again, and then you do something again. Yeah, it's sustaining it is really hard. But I also sometimes think that maybe that's how it's meant to be. It's meant to be temporary, that it's that because sometimes when you become more and more of like an institution with age. So maybe it's good that it's like this brief sudden energy, like a fireworks, and then it's brilliant for a few years. And then it becomes memory, and you look at it in pictures, and then you're like, oh wow, this is great, this happened, and that's how I felt when I first saw the images of Shop 6 and Pinaglabanan, because as you said, they were before my time, and nobody had exhibit catalogs then. You know, there's no documentation available about these spaces. So they were like stories. They were just stories. But it's a good thing that people had the consciousness to document, because there's a lot of spaces actually didn't. So they're not part of the archive because they have no documentation, or their documentation is missing. So that's another thing, you know, like you can't really have a complete sense of the history because not everything was documented. So at that time, when I started putting together the archives of the Manila Artist-Run Spaces, I was focusing on spaces that were closed already, so to somehow delimit, because at that time there was Green Papaya was active, there was Magnet Gallery that was very active also. So I wanted to focus on the spaces that were already closed, and then to see how we could, you know, reconstruct their history, so to speak, you know. But it's good because we had that, well, at least for my generation, Chabet taught us the importance of documenting our work. So we all had photos, we all had clippings, and we saved our invitations, you know. And then Pinaglabanan, we're so lucky that they were well funded, and they, you know, it was very, very well documented, and they had staff to do this, you know, so it was all properly organized, and it was just ready to be digitized. So also because, you know, a lot of these spaces, they were, I mean, it was still analog then, so we had to digitize the material. So good thing they were saved, and I think we ended up, we have around 4,000 records in the Mars collection that I annotated. So that's a big chunk of history. That, well, it's a lot of records, but it's really just a fraction of this long history of artist-run spaces. And yeah, maybe it can be expanded later on. And yeah.
Chuong-Dai, can I just
Yes,
react
of course.
to Ringo's just two things. Thank you, Ringo, that you made it sound like Green Papaya has an easy life.
I know,
And,
it's like
we also had to struggle with motherhood and fatherhood, and all we decided to do was just allow our kid to grow up in Green Papaya, who is now 18 years old. And of course, there is always this problem of, you know, funding. And every time at the end of the year, we always ask ourselves if we can still do it the following year. But I think the other thing that made us also, you know, long-lasting, if you may want to call it that, you also mentioned about being institutionalized. And I think that's the very reason we were able to survive this long, because I've always been resisting the temptation to be institutionalized. I recall that in 2008 Art Asia Pacific Almanac, Andrew Merkel actually predicted Green Papaya is the next institution in Manila. But I said, no, we're not going that direction. We're gonna stay on the ground and remain small. And I think, you know, I credit that decision for us to have been able to stay, you know, this long.
Thank you, Peewee, for reminding us that longevity doesn't go without hardship. And I think actually that's quite important to emphasize, right? That you really had to be able to assess what was going on and strategize in terms of how to transform, rather than just being complacent with the successes that you've had. Yeah, and to Ringo's point about these spaces being short-lived, they were short-lived, but at the same time, I think if we think about the work that you've done, Ringo, in terms of the bookstore right now, and also you're overseeing Roberto Chabet's estate. I see longevity in that way in terms of the projects that you continue to do and the ways that you've taken the lessons that you learned in running one project, and transferring it to something else. I think Green Papaya, the spaces that are in the Mars collection, and also other spaces have been really instrumental in making the contemporary art scene in Manila, the amazing scene that it is. I think it's very unique, in, not only in terms of the number of artist initiatives that have come and go, but also how they've contributed to a density and a complexity of the scene there. We have a couple of questions about funding. You've both touched on this a little bit, but perhaps you can elaborate. So Peewee, there's a question about how Green Papaya is funded. And Ringo, there's a question that goes back to what you were talking about in terms of infrastructure and government funding. And so that question asks, how has that changed or not changed under the current government of Duterte? So if either of you could speak a bit about how the spaces have been funded and what do you see in terms of the funding infrastructure currently?
Well, right now, I think there's, it's not a priority, obviously, of the government. We have the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, which is the main funding body for the arts. I'm not so I don't know how much budget they've allotted for the arts this year, but obviously it's not enough. Like they were giving artists like 5,000 pesos for as a relief for those affected by the pandemic. So there is a little bit of budget, but it's really not enough. Yeah.
Peewee, can you talk about funding? And can I also ask you to talk about it in relation to how do artist-run spaces start and sustain themselves? Because we have another question that asks, in an environment where there's little public funding and perhaps also not enough mentors, right? And so Ringo had spoken quite a bit about the influence of Roberto Chabet on her and her peers. So if we're talking about an environment that doesn't have strong educational resources and public funding, then what are some of the strategies that you have used, you and your collaborators have used to sustain Green Papaya for the last 2 decades?
We opened up Green Papaya in 2000, and it was situated in a space where we were also operating a design studio. One of the motivations for us to start Green Papaya was I retired from my corporate job in 1998. So I used to work as a creative director for a broadcasting company in Manila. And so when I retired, I decided to put up my own design company. And in the same space that we operated Green Papaya, we had a small design studio. I was lucky enough to have been able to win the account of French Spring in Manila. French Spring in Manila was an international arts festival between the Philippines and France, being funded by the French government. And when we started servicing the account in 2000, we promised the the embassy in Manila that we will continue, that the money that we will earn from the account will continue to run Green Papaya for as long as we keep the account. So we were able to keep the account for the next 7 years while the festival was going on in Manila. And so that helped in the operating cost of running a space like Green Papaya. What happened was in 2008, we decided to close Green Papaya with no account to handle. There was no regular funding support. And so we just decided to announce to our community that we're closing Green Papaya. And all of a sudden, all these artists just simply donated works for us to be able to raise some funds for us to continue running Green Papaya. So I would say that from 2008 till today, it's always the artist community that will come into our rescue just to be able to stop us from closing Green Papaya. But also, this is not to say that we were not able to avail of very generous grants from funding institutions. And I would like to mention them now as a way of expressing my gratitude. So there's always the Goethe Institute, of course, in Manila. There's always Japan Foundation. There is Arts Initiative, a Foundation for Arts Initiative based in New York, actually, and Arts Network Asia based in Singapore. So from time to time or in between years, we would be able to secure funding from these institutions to be able to initiate some major programs.
Thank you, Peewee, for reminding us of the many sources of funding that Green Papaya has received. What struck me in terms of what you and Ringo have talked about, and which I'd like to just pull up a little more, is the support that the artists gave one another. Right? And so even though you were all running your own spaces, as I understand, for example, Ringo, you and your collaborators also worked with Green Papaya, right? And so there was always this back and forth between artists who were running their own spaces. So that's something I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about. The other thing I noticed, Peewee, when you were talking about funding sources, is that when you first began, you and Donna had a sense of what you wanted to do, but it was also really important that you had your own financial source to open, right? So you had this contract with French Manila, French Spring, and that provided you a secure financial base to do the programming that you wanted to do, and that lasted you several years. Yeah, and I think that that was really important because then it also gave you time to build your network. Yeah, and then you were able to draw on that network to have institutional sources of funding. Okay. You can correct me if that is incorrect. But first of all, Ringo and Peewee, can you speak a little bit about the overlap in terms of the work that your spaces did and how you supported one another? Ringo, can you start?
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of collaboration in the 90s. Also because the art scene was not so big. So, we all knew each other, and we all supported each other's spaces, there was no feeling of like competition or whatever. It was really everyone doing everyone is like contributing to something for the community. So, and that's I think that's one good thing about our experience. I don't know. I think now it's a bit more. There's so many spaces now. It's like it's hard to really keep track. And it's hard to go to. In the 90s, it was easy. A lot of the spaces were concentrated in certain areas, so you go to Mega Mall and you see 10 galleries there, and then you go to Quezon City and then you visit all the spaces there. But now it's like everyone's so dispersed, so it's harder to move around. But I think there's still a lot of room for working together, and sharing resources is always very important for the art community.
I agree with Ringo that the art scene in Manila is so huge, many galleries. But even during the early 2000s, the art scene was already big. And to think that the market was not yet fully developed by that time. But we're talking here about a big sky mind, future prospects, and Green Papaya, where the artists belong practically to the same community, and we're looking up at one singular person who was mentor and inspiration to everyone, who was Roberto Chabet. So it goes without saying that artists or these three spaces were constantly supporting each other. So we would normally borrow each other's facilities, like LCD projectors, sound systems. Yes, and if one space starts a fundraising, then we all support that particular space. So I'm not very familiar with the networks of newly founded artist-run spaces these days, especially because when the pandemic struck in 2000, I barely go out, and there's not been much happening in these spaces. But what Green Papaya wanted to do before it closes down, because we've been planning this closing, was last meeting we had with 98B, for example, one of the artist spaces that was founded by artists Mark Salvatos and curator Mayumi Hirano, that it was inherited by younger generation of artists. We were actually talking about putting together an artist-run spaces summit before Green Papaya closes. So I don't know if we are able to do that in 2022 or maybe at the latest in 2023. So by then we will be able to map out and assess what's the condition of artist-run spaces currently in Metro Manila.
Thank you so much, Ringo and Peewee, for sharing your insights about the spaces that you ran and also the ecologies that you've been a part of. I see Jane, so I think we have to stop, even though this conversation is so interesting and I would like it to continue, but Jane.
Well, all I can say is this has been fascinating, and we've had lots and lots of questions in the Q&A, which we will relay to you. We haven't been able to get to all of them. I mean, it sounds like there was a major shift recently with a kind of explosion of smaller spaces or new spaces or a lot of spaces. And of course, I want to know why, but maybe we should come back some other time to talk about that. But I certainly hope you go ahead with your summit. So whatever you need to make that possible, maybe the community here watching will help that happen, because that sounds like it would be a great handoff in a way, to a contribution to a younger generation of art spaces. But I want to thank you both very much, Ringo and Peewee, for allowing us the opportunity at Asia Art Archive to work with your material, work with your documentation, and to help us together create a record and a history of the wonderful work that so many artists and you all have done over, the past 2 decades and more, 3 decades for you, Peewee. So that's a great honor for us. And I hope that researchers around the world will be working with them and helping all of us find the stories and create new stories about art in the Philippines, but art and artist spaces everywhere. So thank you very much, Chuong-Dai, Peewee, Ringo, and I'm afraid we have to stop now. But thank you all, the rest of you, for coming, and we'll see you soon. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
Bye-bye.